Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Big Brother Canada following week 2, and the power rankings actually shifted quite a bit from last week, given that we know more about these players' games, and obviously we had a whole other week of content to get into, so expect quite a bit of movement there. But there are 15 players to talk about, and let's not waste any more time, let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 15, we have the latest boot of the season, but here we have John Michael. And it sucks seeing him go, given he was one of the bigger superfans coming into it, and there were even people that were willing to save him coming into the latest vote, and even afterwards, even though they voted him out, it's now looking like they regretted that decision, now that they know that Zach is running the game, and at the end of the day, they seem to regret that decision to vote him out. However, he's now out of the game, and there's not much that can be done there, so because of that, he is here at number 15. And with that, there are 14 players left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win based on their current game position. But at number 14, and this is a little awkward, but we actually have the person I had at number 1 of last week's ranking, but here we have Rob. Now I will say that I do regret putting him at number 1, as I feel like had I made that video a day later, I would have had him lower, given that there's been more talk about targeting him sooner, and just him not being aware of what's happening. And then ultimately we see that come to fruition where he is ultimately the target by the end of the week. Now I will say that I probably would have had him a bit higher than this spot even last week, as I didn't think they would actually go for the shot this week, but he is there now and he seems pretty screwed. Now, there is talk about voting to save him. We know that Koozie is at least talking through some of the options. We know that there are votes there to save Rob, particularly if they think that he's going to take the shot at Zach, which seems pretty likely at this point. However, I just don't see it as being particularly likely. I think while there is this talk now that by the time of the actual eviction, they will just go along with it, keep Zach happy, and just hope that someone else will take the shot later on. So I think Rod's pretty much screwed here, which is why he's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and the only reason this person isn't lower on the list is because they're the HOH right now, but here we have Dan Zabo, and you would think that considering he won HOH that we would be seeing more of Dan, but really he's been largely invisible during these daily drops, and when you mix that in with his position, it's not looking that great, where even though I had him relatively low on last week's ranking, it turns out that since then, he would have been the target coming into this week had he not won HOH, which is pretty crazy to think about, that despite these guys running the game, that Dan is not only not included in that, but he would have been this target in order to throw out the perception that the guys were working together. And then after winning his HOH, despite having this chance to build his own power structure, especially considering how weakly Santina did so in week 1, he just does what Zach and Ty want, which is to target Rob, which doesn't even benefit Dan's game. And even worse is that Zach and Ty are already looking to next week where they're still going to target Dan. So essentially, Dan is using his HOH to do the dirty work of the people that are going to take him out the very next week. And mixing that in with him not really doing much to where he's barely on the feeds, it's just not looking good for Dan. And because of that, he is here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we actually have someone who has dropped off quite a bit from last week. But here we have Hope, who literally wanted to quit the game coming into this week, and that was a big reason why he dropped quite a bit, to where now, even though he has come around to wanting to stay in the game, that's just going to be such a big knock against him if he were to make it further into the game. I feel like it's something that's going to be brought up. And even beyond that, he doesn't seem to be in a good spot, where the main reason I had him so high on last week's ranking is because he did seem to be within this core majority guys group. But then even within that, we saw later in the JM round that they don't respect him at all. Like, Hope is one of the people that wanted to vote to save JM, but then when the other guys are talking about how Hope was wanting to save JM, they were literally laughing at Hope, which makes it pretty clear that the guys simply don't respect him. And yes, while you could say that people aren't targeting him now, despite him being someone that needs constant reassurance, I feel like that's another position that could eventually get on people's nerves. And I feel like the only benefit to his game is that people on the outs could see him as a number to take out the Zacks down the road. But even then, I don't really see him gain much respect within the game to eventually win, which is a big knock against him for his long-term prospects. So I feel like at the end of the day, after further evaluation, Hope doesn't seem to have much hope in the game, which is a big reason I have him here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have another player that has dropped off significantly, but here we have Zach. And I kind of expected this to happen to Zach. I feel like he was so out in front to where if a shot were to be taken at the guys, that he would probably be one of the biggest targets on the board. And we are seeing that play out. However, I feel like even beyond that, Zach has played pretty poorly, where I haven't even talked about his move to want to target John Michael, which is pretty bad considering that John Michael wanted to work with him. He also wanted to target Dan Zabo in week 2 before Dan won HOH, which is also a pretty bad move considering that Dan also wanted to work with Zach in the future. And even now that he wants to target Rob, it makes no sense for Zach to target Rob either, as it just opens it up for the guys to be targeted down the road. And plus, Rob still trusted Zach quite a bit. So the fact that Zach is going along with this is pretty insane. And now that you have people talking about how big of a threat Zach is, the fact that Zach is also micromanaging everyone to where people are talking about how they want to take the shot at him sooner rather than later. Now you can debate when the shot will be taken, but I feel like the way Zach has played the game so far, I can't justify having him any higher than number 11. Now we're moving on to number 10, and this is a person that hasn't really moved up in my estimation. It's more so other people moving down, but here we have Vanessa. And I feel like Vanessa has been pretty invisible in the feed so far, where she does get brought up occasionally. However, it's just that none of that is good, where people don't seem to trust her that much. She doesn't seem to be included in really much of anything. And while we have heard of incidents of her revealing information, we haven't really seen that on the daily drops, and we haven't really seen it really benefit her game at all. People aren't exactly looking at Vanessa particularly highly. So I feel like that's a pretty big knock. And at the end of the day, I just don't have much faith in Vanessa to do well within the game. But I feel like compared to the people we already talked about, she doesn't have as many blatant holes in her game, which is why I do have her here at number 10. Now we're moving on to number 9, and we have another player that I view pretty mediocrely. However, I feel like they are coming out of it a bit better, although it's still not great. But here we have Santina, and I think Santina's in a bit of a rough patch at this point, where she is going to be losing Rod this week, who is one of her closer allies. And I feel like beyond that, people don't exactly trust her either. Now, I feel like her position isn't as bad as someone like a Vanessa, where she at least still has good relationships with a lot of the guys, and she has okay bonds with the other players outside of that alliance. Although I feel like if the guys' alliance blows up soon, that Santina will pretty much be at the bottom of whatever group she ends up afterwards. So I don't feel like Santina's in the best spot at this point. But I feel like compared to the other people, she has more pros, which is why she is here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and this is a bit of a weird pick given this person is currently on the block, but here we have Renee. And Renee is obviously on the block. She was put up as a pawn to allow the broad backdoor to happen, and she seems to be pretty safe. Now, there is currently talks about voting to save Rob and take out Renee as a result. However, it's still not great that Renee, again, is on the block once again. I feel like she has a lot of potential to just be the perpetual pawn this season. And even then, there's still talk of her going home in the future, which I don't like. But it's still the fact that she does have more relationships than a Santina. Like, she has people like a Ty, for example. She has like a lot of the women there. I feel like she has a bit more numbers, but I feel like in the long term, I just don't have much faith in Renee, which is why I have her here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and I'm a bit surprised this person is this high on the list, considering I don't think they're that good of a player, but based on recent days, it seems like they're in an alright position. But here we have Anika, and I don't think Anika is a good player. I think her lack of game experience is really showing. Like, we had the conversation between her and Daniel before the jam vote, where Daniel was trying to outline to her that they're on the outs, and that they should do something about it. And then Anika was like, well, maybe we should just float, which I feel like is not the ideal strategy there. And I feel like in general, she's not the best strategically. However, she does have some pros going for her, like the fact that she did get Ty to use the veto on her in week 1 is pretty good. But I feel like the big pro for her is now she is being included in some alliances. She is in an alliance with Koozie and Daniel, which I think could be a solid group for her in the future. And plus, I think she could benefit well from the guys turning against each other in the weeks to come. I feel like if there's a major confrontation that Anika will be unlikely to be targeted given she is such a small threat. But I also feel like that's still going to be a detriment for her in the long term, where I don't see Anika playing that effective of a game, and I don't really see her garnering much respect later on. Now, again, it's only week 2, so things could change, but I feel like Anika is largely up here because of her current position and her longer term prospects, not so much because I feel like she's that likely to win, but it's still enough to have her here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and I'm a bit surprised this person is at least this high. However, I still feel like they're playing this week pretty poorly, but here we have Ty. And I think Ty's decision to go for Rob this week is very early, too early in fact, to where I feel like it's just going to open things up for his position to be weakened in the future, especially because Rob still trusted Ty and was still open to working with him in the future. Now I get Ty's sentiment that Rob has these other numbers that he doesn't have and that makes his position a bit weaker. But I feel like this was the wrong approach where he's just taking the shot at Rob now and just creating all this chaos that doesn't really benefit his game. And plus, I feel like his relationship with Claudia has been pretty awkward. I feel like that's something that I should mention as well. I just don't feel like Ty's the best player in the world, and I feel like his read on the whole situation is pretty flawed, just in general. However, the main reason I don't have him lower on the list is that I think he's more likely to survive the fallout of this round compared to someone like a Zach. I feel like people are a bit annoyed by Ty, but I feel like they're going to go for Zach first. And I think after he's broken up from Zach, that Ty could potentially regroup to a degree. Now, whether he will, we'll have to see. But I feel like for now, I feel like 6 is about as high as it can put him. Now moving on to number 5, and there's definitely a debate for this person to be lower on the list. However, I feel like this person at least has more potential and a bit more pros than some other people we already talked about. But here we have Shayna, and it's not looking great for Shayna, where both of her closest allies are on the block. One of them is guaranteed to go home, and that's not great. Plus, she also has a bit of a showmance, or at least try to get a showmance going with Rob, only for that to not work out, and it's not great. However, I feel like once Rob goes, I feel like she has more potential to regroup. I feel like she has better social connections than a lot of the other people we already talked about on the list, which is something that is boosting her to a degree. But I still feel like this week will be a net negative for her in terms of her losing one of her closer allies there, which is why I have her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I feel like this top 4 is pretty definitive based on this week, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 4, I did decide to go with Claudia here. And the main reason I did is I feel like her relationship with Ty is getting a bit more strained, where their conversations have been pretty awkward up to this point, which is pretty funny, but it's also a bit of a weird situation. Now, I think as Ty realizes that its position is weakening, that he could end up coming back to Claudia. However, even then, that may not be a guarantee if Claudia ends up siding more with the people outside the core group. So I feel like Claudia is in a pretty interesting position where she's still riding the middle. Now, we'll see how she manages that in the future, but I feel like she's still in one of the better positions within the house, which is a big reason I have her this high. But there are still enough question marks about what will happen in the future, particularly with her relationship with Ty, that leaves her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this is sort of a weird pick, as had I made my week 1 ranking one day later, this person would have been the clear number 1. And I feel like for most of the week, this person has clearly been one of the best positions within the house. But I feel like in recent days, I've had a bit of hesitancy with them. But here we have Jonathan. And the main reason I bumped Jonathan down is I don't like the way that he's been pitching for Rob to stay, where he's pretty clearly closer to Rob than he is to the other group. And through that, he has been advocating for fighting for like Rob to stay. And plus, Renee is one of his closer allies as well, also on the block. So he's sort of in a weird spot at this point. And I feel like he hasn't approached it the best. Now, granted, he could just recover by the end and he could find himself back in number 1, but it did make me doubt his game ability just a bit. Now, aside from that, he is still in the best position within the house. Plenty of people seem to trust him. And I feel like for the most part, he's been pretty good at getting information from people without revealing too much from himself. And plus, he's been a pretty calm president. He's been pretty likable as well. So I feel like Jonathan is still in a pretty solid position. However, I feel like with the current situation that he's in a bit of a weird spot that could make his position worse in the future, which was enough to leave him here at number 3. Now we're moving on to number 2, and I feel like these top 2 are pretty close for me, and I feel like they've been largely influenced by events that have happened in recent days, and it's just a matter of ordering them. Although at number 2, I did decide to go with Koozie, as I feel like Koozie is in a slightly worse position than a number 1 person. However, I will give Koozie a lot of credit for creating this new alliance of her, Daniel, and Anika that I think could really benefit if the guys were to turn on each other, which, based on what's currently happening, is a possibility. However, the reason I didn't put her at number 1 is I feel like her relationship with the guys isn't as solid, and I feel like if there's a situation where the guys are able to win HOH next week and get back into power, that Koozie may not benefit as much from that compared to the number 1 person. So I feel like that was enough to make me hold back from putting this person at number 1, but I could very well see it happening in the future. But as it stands, I still give them a lot of credit for creating that alliance. I feel like in recent days they've been becoming a bit more active in the game, and I feel like they've been getting better relationships in the game to where I have a lot of confidence in their future in the game, which is why I have them here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Big Brother Canada 11 right now is Daniel. And I think for me, it comes down to his relationship with the guys, where I feel like the guys have a better relationship with Daniel compared to Koozie. And I feel like Daniel has been in a better position from earlier on in the game compared to Koozie. And I feel like that was enough to give him the edge for me. Now, I will give Koozie more credit for creating this alliance. Now, we'll see where the alliance actually goes. But I feel like Daniel has more options in the future compared to Koozie, or at least at this current moment. And I feel like that was enough to give him the edge for me this week. And because of that, he is here at number 1. And there we go, that will do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps out with the channel. And I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so stay tuned for that. We are nearing the end of Australian Survivor Heroes vs Villains, so you can expect endgame coverage for that. I'm currently covering Survivor 44 as well, and doing weekly power rankings of that show as well, so you can expect that. And if you haven't already, be sure to join my Discord server, which I'll leave a link to join in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.